A thick mist clung to the cobblestone streets, swirling around the ankles of curious onlookers who gathered with a mix of anticipation and unease before the once grand opera house. Its limestone pillars and stately facade, previously battered by a century of neglect, were now painstakingly restored to a semblance of former glory. Flickering lanterns cast ghostly light across the carved cherubs perched at the edges of the rooftop, and for a moment one could swear the stone figures moved. Locals whispered that the theater was cursed, that a tragedy within these walls had left an indelible stain. Yet, curiosity, that unyielding force, propelled them through the heavy doors, lured by the promise of an opera that sought to reclaim both the building's shattered reputation and their own sense of cultural pride. I was among those who found themselves inexplicably drawn to this night. Perhaps it was the promise of witnessing a legendary performance, or my own fascination with places on the fringe of the mundane. Many years ago, rumors circulated about the bizarre disappearance of an entire opera troupe on the eve of their debut. People said the final notes of the leading soprano's aria lingered in the air, even as the cast took their bows. And then, in a single heartbeat, they vanished. Since that evening, the building succumbed to dust and decay, waiting in the darkness like a dormant beast. When a mysterious benefactor funded its restoration, no one believed the place could truly come back to life. Yet here it stood, imposing and eerie, beckoning music lovers from near and far. I sensed that being present at the grand reopening was not merely an invitation, but a summons. Soft torches lit the marble foyer with restless flames. The slightest draft caused the shadows to dance among the columns, as if ominous shapes leapt out from behind the stone to greet each visitor before vanishing just as quickly. The air was thick with the smell of damp velvet, fresh paint, and an undercurrent of something sweeter, perhaps flowers? Or maybe remnants of decaying potpourri left behind from years gone by. I could taste the humidity on my tongue, so heavy and moist that it felt as though I had stepped into a centuries-old crypt. Motionless ushers lined the hall, their faces almost unnaturally pale. When one of them took my coat and handed me a playbill, I noticed a flicker in his gaze that suggested a clandestine dread, though not a word passed his lips about any danger lurking within. I took a seat in one of the gilded balconies, surrounded by plush red upholstery that still retained the faint odor of mothballs beneath whatever perfume had been sprayed for the benefit of tonight's guest. The stage curtain, thick with golden tassels, awaited some unseen cue. I scanned the playbill. The opera was said to be a revival of the piece that had once promised to bring the company fabulous acclaim before disaster struck. No composer's name was listed, only a description of a tragic love story culminating in an otherworldly lament. Strangely, the entire cast was listed simply by their roles, the soprano, the tenor, the baritone, and so forth, with no personal details. The pit orchestra was similarly anonymous, indicated only by a single line, a special ensemble for this auspicious performance. The pages felt cold in my fingers, as though they exuded a chill of apprehension. A hush spread across the auditorium as the house lights went low. Lamp lights mounted along the side pillars began to sputter, casting erratic shadows that scrambled across the ornate ceiling. The conductor, whose face was obscured by odd angles of reflected light, raised his baton. An ancient hush descended, like the collective inhale before some sacred rite. Then came the first haunting chord, resonating from the instruments with a fullness that filled my chest. It was a sound that soared and sank in the same breath, a heavy chord that dipped into minor intervals, summoning a sense of unshakables. My pulse quickened and a tingling wave spread over my arms as though I had just brushed against some intangible presence. When the vast curtain parted, my heart clenched. The stage design was a dazzling reproduction of a Baroque courtyard under moonlight. Gnarled trees, their branches twisting toward a sickly green sky, loomed over crumbling columns. In the foreground stood the soprano, robed in iridescent fabric that caught the faint glow of the stage lights. A translucent veil pinned with glittering jewels shrouded her face. She lifted her arms in a plea toward the painted heavens, her voice erupting in a lament so pure and despairing that I felt tears brim at my eyes unbidden. In that voice rang the echo of heartbreak centuries in the making. It felt ancient, primal, unmoored from any single era, like a sorrow older than time itself. Around me, the audience sat mesmerized, scarcely daring to breathe. Yet, for all the skill of her performance, something about her appearance unnerved me. There was a strange pallor to her exposed arms, an ethereal glow emanating from beneath her veil. It was almost as if the stage lights were passing through her, giving her an otherworldly translucence. Beside her, the tenor emerged. He wore a brocade costume of midnight blue, richly embroidered, yet oddly stiff, as though the garments had been lifted from a dusty trunk, unused for decades. When he sang, his voice, though resonant, carried a trace of echo, as if he were singing from a deep ravine. Perhaps it was only my anxious imagination, but the reverb of his notes seemed to trace a line right to my chest, leaving me breathless. As the story unfolded, of two star-crossed lovers doomed by political machinations to separate, only to meet again in death, I could almost sense the intangible essence of anguish rising from the stage like a mist. The entire cast moved with a slow, measured grace, a composure that felt both acutely disciplined and unearthly. Each step and turn was choreographed to perfection, yet their gestures were laden with an underlying desperation. The music soared in swirling crescendos, plunging into hushed passages laced with dissonance that caused the hair on my arms to stand on end. It must have been during the second act that I truly realized something was terribly wrong. A draft brushing past my balcony seat compelled me to glance upward. Overhead, in the highest recesses of the theater, I glimpsed silhouettes that seemed to watch from the catwalk. Their eyes glimmered with a faint glow, and I could discern more than half a dozen forms. Something about their silent vigil reminded me of guardians or judges in a hidden gallery. The conductor's baton flickered in the corner of my vision, a reflection that suggested an unnatural flame. The swirling music carried with it a wail, indistinct yet tangible, that was not part of the scored composition. It was as though a different voice cried out from behind the melodic lines, mourning some ancient sorrow beyond the mortal realm. When I turned my eyes back to the stage, I saw that the baritone and mezzo had joined the leading pair for a quartet, confronted by a menacing figure robed in black, presumably the story's villain. Despite his menacing presence, the tension felt more tangible than mere theater. The candles flickered ominously, their flames twisting into shapes like serpents. I leaned forward and spotted in the footlights a shape that did not belong. Was it a face, half-formed, peering up at the performers from behind the footlight arches? The face was contorted in rage or horror, but disappeared as quickly as I noticed it. My heart thudded in my chest. All the while the singing never ceased. Instead, the voices layered upon each other, growing, swirling, reaching an apex of excruciating sadness. Then came the aria that held the story's climax. The same aria I had read about in fragments across newspaper clippings and local legends. The memory of the original performance's tragedy resurged in me, and I could scarcely breathe for fear that this was the moment we had all been quietly dreading. The soprano stood alone. The stage now plunged into a deep hush as the set was draped in smoky half-light. She lifted her face to the heavens and began to sing. Her voice was a lament to lost love, to broken promises, and the inexorable finality of fate. It lilted up, weaving through the rafters, hovering between the tapestries and the carved cherubs overhead. It soared, right to the boundary of human hearing, then dropped into a sob that could have riven the most callous heart. A hush fell across the auditorium, broken only by the occasional gasp or muffled sob from the enthralled audience. We were entranced, powerless in our seats, enthralled by both terror and wonder. The notes coalesced into a crescendo that exceeded anything I had ever experienced. The entire earthen realm seemed too fragile to contain that sound. As the final note lingered in the hush, thunder seemed to growl in the distance. A sudden crackle of lightning illuminated the entire stage from an unseen electrical source, revealing the soprano's features at last. Her eyes were closed in ecstatic agony, tears streaming down her translucent cheeks. But that was not the only revelation. Behind her I could see that the once solid sets and props appeared intangible, flickering around the edges, as if they too were illusions, conjured by some spectral force. I realized we were no longer simply watching an opera performance. We were witnessing the reenactment of the curse that had trapped these performers all those years ago. In that fleeting flash of light, I discerned the silhouettes behind the stage, a half-dozen figures in partial costume, huddled in the darkness, translucent with the same pale glow. They hovered on the outskirts of the scene, pleading silently with hands extended, as though they yearned to join in the lament, yet were forever barred from the stage's center. A single violin screeched, and the lights flickered again. I heard gasps ripple through the balcony as the illusions parted like smoke, revealing the soprano, kneeling, her hands clenched around the tenors. His eyes were wide open and unblinking, shining with a pale, unnatural light. At that moment I sensed movement above and turned my gaze upwards. The watchers in the catwalk lofts were leaning out dangerously, their mouths slightly open, as if tasting the sorrow pouring off the stage. Without warning, the entire row of them disappeared behind a passing swirl of shadows. The hush in the auditorium deepened, thickening the air until it felt like we were far below ground, buried alive in the throes of a funeral dirge. My throat constricted. I dared not move. I could barely manage to blink for fear of missing some crucial shift in the nightmare unraveling before me. It happened so fast, the final chord built in synergy with the soprano's chilling vibrato, and with one last flicker of the footlights, the cast collapsed. Not theatrically, but as though the strength were literally drained from their forms. Their bodies hit the stage with a dull thud. A collective gasp escaped the audience. At first I thought it was part of the storyline's tragic ending, a highly dramatic flourish. But the air changed, thickening with the tang of ozone, the same dryness you smell after lightning strikes. Then the lights fluttered violently, and the entire stage was plunged into blackness. A hushed pandemonium ensued. I could sense people in the stalls rising to their feet, uncertain whether to applaud, to scream, or to rush the stage for help. Murmurs rippled and grew, chairs squeaked, and footsteps shuffled. The darkness was profound and disorienting, until one by one, the chandeliers overhead reignited their lamps, revealing an empty stage. Every performer was gone, disappeared, just like the day of the original tragedy. A heavy, oppressive dread settled over us. We realized we had borne witness to the same phenomenon that had swallowed the original performers decades ago, and we were trapped within the same walls. A booming voice cut through the tension. It was the caretaker, an ancient man in a rumpled coat who had been overseeing the ticket office. He stood upon the stage, a battered lantern swinging in his grip. His eyes burned with a secret knowledge, though he did not seem triumphant, merely resigned. "Go home," he murmured, his deep voice echoing in the unnatural hush. "There will be no more encores this night. The performance is done." Perhaps it was the stricken look in his eyes, or the fact that his words were laden with an incongruent calm, but the crowd obeyed. Slowly, people began to shuffle out, murmuring among themselves, uncertain whether they had experienced a performance of rare genius or a brush with the supernatural. I was among the last to leave my seat, compelled by the caretaker's haunted expression to approach him. He remained on the stage, scanning the darkness, as though expecting the performers to reappear. I watched him carefully, uncertain if he was a harbinger of the cursed fate or an unwitting attendant to the ghosts. When I finally gathered the courage to approach, I asked him what had happened. He sighed, wearily rubbing his eyes. "This place is bound by a lament older than you know," he said plainly. "They return every generation, believing they can release themselves by singing the final aria, but it only binds them more firmly. The moment that last note fades, they vanish back into the gloom, living and dead alike." "But," I stammered, my voice breaking, "was the cast alive to begin with?" He gazed at me with dark, solemn eyes, as if my question had answered itself. "Living or dead is just a matter of perspective here," he replied cryptically. Then his features twisted in an expression of sorrow. "No one forced them onto that stage. Their hearts were filled with hubris, thinking they could master that aria, defy the old curse, and triumph where the original company failed. They never realized they were venturing into a snare that was laid long before we were born." As people continued to file out, the caretaker turned away, focusing on a small drawer built into one side of the stage. From it, he retrieved dusty sheets of music, frayed at the edges and spotted with old ink stains. Each page bore a swirling script that seemed half cursive, half sigil, a language beyond standard notation. With a trembling hand, he tucked them back into the drawer. Every so often, someone opens this place and attempts to rid it of evil. But the opera is patient. It seduces new voices with the promise of applause and immortality. Once the aria is sung, its final note draws them in and holds them fast, feeding off their souls. He let out a hollow laugh. "They'll be back. Sooner or later, they always come back." Despite the caretaker's ominous instructions, I found I could not simply abandon the theater. A potent force tugged me, refusing to let me go without at least one final glimpse. Slipping behind the heavy crimson grapes, I descended through a labyrinth of corridors. The brick walls were cold and damp, as though the building were situated at the bottom of a lake. At intervals, I passed half-lit mirrors flanked by flickering bulbs, discovering reflections that seemed to distort my features with each step. The hush of the deserted backstage corridors hummed with a presence that threatened to draw me deeper. The storerooms were a realm apart, filled with dusty costumes, broken props, and leftover set pieces from long-funked productions. I sifted through it all as quietly as I could, my footsteps muffled by a century's worth of dust. Then I heard it, a faint hum, a line of the tragic aria repeated softly, echoing as though someone was singing just around the corner. That sorrowful melody wove its way through the gloom, calling me to follow. My heart pounded as I moved toward the sound, unstoppable despite the brimming panic in my chest. I turned a corner into a small dressing room. In the shadows, the soprano's veil was draped over a wooden stool, shimmering faintly, as if it possessed its own luminescence. The hum continued, no body accompanied it, just that mournful line. The note ceased only when I lifted the veil. It disintegrated in my hands like ashes, leaving behind a ghostly outline etched in the air, which also quickly faded. The hush that followed was absolute, crushing in its finality. It settled over me like a coffin lid sealing shut. I fled, swallowing a scream as I scrambled through the corridors, desperate to escape the building's labyrinthine grasp. By the time I emerged onto the street, the thick mist had dissipated. The crowd was gone. Moonlight draped the opera house in a sterile glow, revealing every carved detail of cherubs and gargoyles. Yet without the bustle of an audience, the place looked condemned anew. If I hadn't just witnessed the night's performance with my own eyes, I would have taken it for an empty shell. One or two curious souls hovered near the entrance, uncertain whether they had dreamt the evening's events, but their eyes, like mine, carried the weight of something inescapably real. No one spoke. In silence, we turned and drifted away. Though the caretaker had given his dismissal, the city had not. Over the ensuing days, rumors rippled through every cafe, tavern, and parlor. Conflicting tales emerged. Some said the performance was an ingenious spectacle that used illusions and trickery. Others were certain they had witnessed a dance of spirits, and everyone agreed on one point. When the final note of that aria was sung, the entire cast vanished. The manager who financed the production was nowhere to be found, and the caretaker, too, vanished after closing the doors one final time. It was as if the entire space existed only in a fleeting moment of midnight enchantment, an echo of the tragedy that refused to be silenced. I often tried to confirm what I had seen. I consulted city records, old diaries, and library archives. Each offered fragments, mentions of bizarre happenings, missing performers, half-finished articles that never reached a conclusion. The longer I researched, the stronger my conviction that the Opera House was a place between worlds, its stage a threshold bridging mortal art and unholy enchantment. One detail stood out. A handwritten note in a tattered compendium of local lore. It read, "The aria's final note dooms all who dare perform it to wander unseen, straining against the bars of eternity. Spectators bear witness to the ephemeral union of life and death, until the next naive troupe attempts to break its cycle. Sometimes, late at night, I recall the leading soprano's lament. It rises unbidden in my memory, sliding through the cracks of consciousness. I can almost feel the plush seat beneath me, see the golden tassels swaying at the edge of my vision. My heart aches for the lost voices, their ephemeral chants at redemption slipping away as each generation of performers tries, and fails, to bring the aria to a peaceful conclusion. Even now, I wonder if the ghosts remain trapped within those walls, forced to repeat that tragic love story for an audience that can neither save them nor silence their lament." Word circulates again, quietly, discreetly, that a new group of singers has grown fascinated by the legend. They talk in hushed tones at small recitals, at music schools, at dinner parties, excitedly speculating whether the curse is genuine. From a distance, I listen without interfering, though my chest tightens with dread. It is only a matter of time before they find themselves drawn by that intangible power. Stepping onto that velvet stage before flickering lights and expectant onlookers, the cycle will begin anew, and the final note will hang in the air like the stifling breath of centuries long dead. And in that lingering note, another cast will vanish, swallowed by the vow of an eternal encore, the opera that never ends.